Good afternoon, grown black folks talk. Today, some ghost stories. Now, I don't actually observe Halloween on most occasions, but I thought about something yesterday in light of the excitement that there is over Robert Miller's arrest and indictment of some of the people in President Trump's circle. A lot of people think we've started down the road to impeachment and removal. We need to look at that in light of some rather disturbing American history. And that's why I call this Ghost Stories. I also gained some inspiration from Dr. Joe Canton, with whom I talked this morning, and realized that with the kind of grasp of history that is available, a lot of us do not know this history because it has been hidden from us. And so let me go ahead and educate us. But I'm calling it Ghost Stories for a reason. I'm going to begin, and the larger part of this talk today is going to be about two previous Republican presidents with big names. We're going to start with Abraham Lincoln, because the Republican Party likes to be known as the Party of Lincoln. Well, here's a story about President Lincoln that you may not know. And if you want to find more information about this, there is source material. I want you to go to Google and put in there the words McClellan, and that's spelled M-C, big C, Lellan, General George Brenton McClellan. McClellan is dismissed. You can Google this to find sourcing for what I'm about to tell you. General McClellan is the Union general that you've probably never heard of. And he was successful in building a United States Army that was ready to go fight the Confederacy. He defended Washington, D.C. ably by building defenses around it. He put together part of the plan that would eventually be used to take the Union to victory. However, he is effectively erased from history. As far as I'm able to determine, McClellan had some problems of his own in that he was very cautious and not as forward as his most famous opponent, Robert E. Lee, who was much more aggressive. But the other thing he had going against him was he was a Democrat, and there was an election coming up. And Abraham Lincoln already knew that if he gave McClellan the supplies that he was asking for and the resources that he said that he needed, and somehow McClellan, who managed to march within 8 miles of the Confederate capital, if he managed to pull this off, then McClellan as a Democrat would have a very good chance of being able to win the presidency, thereby taking Abraham Lincoln out of office in 1864. Now, as I say, General McClellan had his own problems. There's no guarantee that if Lincoln had fully supported him, that he would have been able to bring the Civil War to a close. But the fact is, President Lincoln refused to fully support him, and even when McClellan had marched to the exact same spot to which Ulysses S. Grant, a good Republican, would eventually win the Civil War, Lincoln not only failed to support him with the supplies he said he needed, but removed him at what may have been a good moment of victory. Because as events would prove 2 years later, not even the aggressive Robert E. Lee could defend Richmond against Grant once Grant had gotten to the point that McClellan had been at 2 years before. McClellan is dismissed. The source material for this that I'm telling you suggests that Abraham Lincoln undersupported and removed McClellan ultimately because he did not want a Democrat to be successful, because that Democrat could have run against him for president, which would mean that the decision Abraham Lincoln made to underdo McClellan's support and to remove him was responsible for the Civil War stretching another 2 years, 2.5 years. And if we admit to that, then we also must admit that this decision cost 500,000 extra lives, 66,000 of which were United States colored troops, and 434,000 of which were white men. 200,000 or so of those were on the same side as Abraham Lincoln. There's evidence for at least a suggestion that Mr. Lincoln was willing to throw their lives away to make sure he would win the next election. Because indeed, General McClellan did run against Abraham Lincoln in the next election, but because he had been disgraced, there was no possibility of him winning. Now, that's conjecture. That cannot be proven exactly, and even when you read the source materials, it is a strong conjecture, but too much history has been lost. We will never know that for sure. But I want you to put that down, the possibility that the first president of the party of Lincoln used political calculations to determine whether or not he would support a general who could have brought the war to an end earlier than it did. Next to that, we're going to put down some cold, hard evidence. We're going to go to another famous Republican president, Richard Milhous Nixon. Now, you can find this in a documentary called Reputation. I believe it's called The Secret World of Richard Nixon. And there's part one and part two. And in part two, I believe, of this document, you can find this if you look for it on YouTube. It will talk about how Richard Nixon, in order to become president, to win his election, sabotaged the peace process that was going on during the Vietnam War as early as 1968. Lyndon Johnson had said he was not going to come back into office. He's not going to run because he was going to put his energies into putting an end to the Vietnam War. And he had managed to get the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese to come to the negotiating table, or at least get close to considering it. But Richard Nixon recognized that if that happened, his whole plank for running for president would be destroyed. And so he began, through back channels, to convince the South Vietnamese not to go to the negotiating table until he was president, because he would get them a better deal. The people who were involved in this have come forward, of course, since then, and that's why there are several documentaries that reference this fact. Richard Nixon won the election. He did not bring anything better to the table, and so the war stretched on for 4 more years. It cost the lives of an additional 20,000 American soldiers, 600,000 Vietnamese, and we haven't even counted the 1 to 2 million Cambodians that died in Cambodia when Richard Nixon decided to expand the war to Cambodia to supposedly take down North Vietnamese supplies and reinforcements coming from there with no proof. So you're now talking about potentially 2.6 million people that Richard Milhous Nixon was willing to sacrifice to his presidency. But those of you who are old enough will remember that that's not why Richard Nixon was impeached. Because there's something else here you need to understand. The reason that we know what Richard Nixon was doing before his election is because Lyndon Johnson, the president, a Democrat, found out. Now, would you like to know how much Lyndon Johnson, the leader of the Democratic Party, did to expose this crime against humanity that Richard Nixon was committing? Absolutely nothing. The leader of the Democratic Party did absolutely nothing of substance. He could have destroyed Richard Nixon before he ever began. He did nothing. Do you know why the Democrats eventually did something about Watergate? Watergate was a Watergate hotel, and at that time, it was Democratic headquarters. So when Richard Nixon came for them directly, then they did something about it. But they had known for years that Richard Nixon was the worst kind of criminal. The kind for human lives, even within his own country, meant nothing. Again, conjecture that Abraham Lincoln may have put to the side the lives of 200,000 American soldiers in order to make sure he would be reelected. Here you have in Richard Nixon someone who knows that more American soldiers are going to die if he does what he does. It does not matter to him. He's eventually impeached because of his cover-up of the Watergate burglary. But even so, Democrats only moved because he came directly for them. Now, we have sitting on the table 3 million ghosts from 2 Republican presidents. At least. Tell me what Donald Trump has done with that kind of background that is going to earn him an impeachment in that kind of environment. Well, since we have Richard Milhous Nixon talking about the lives of 2.5 million Asian people as not being worth any trouble, you do have Donald Trump walking around threatening like he's going to blow North Korea off the map. Maybe that would be enough. But again, Richard Milhous Nixon was not impeached until after Watergate, which also tells you that the Democrats are perfectly willing to sit by and allow these things to happen now. So it's not just the Republican Party that is corrupted, but you also have the Democrats. And by the way, you know why this is? Go back into your American history. Despite our American ideals that are expressed in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, here is the practical three facts of how America, the United States of America, became a rich and powerful nation. Genocide of the native inhabitants of North America, which we refer to as the Indians or the Native American, and the enslavement of African people, and the acquiescence to the fact that a poor white was never going to be anything but a poor white. You can read that in the Federalist Papers number 10, how James Madison recommended the Constitution as setting up a system that would forever keep people divided into factions so that the better and best sort would have nothing to fear from the worst sort of people. Well, he wasn't talking about the Native American because the Native American was just a savage. He wasn't talking about the African because the African wasn't even human. He was talking about the exploitation of poor white people and keeping them to where they would always have the pursuit of happiness, but there was no way in the system that they could reach it. However, same James Madison and company realized that there would have to be a necessity for a Bill of Rights to add to the Constitution to at least give something so the poor white man would feel that he had a chance. But again, that had nothing to do with the rights of Native Americans and black people. And that means that you're talking about the ghosts of tens, if not hundreds of millions of black people and Native American people who were sacrificed to the United States of America. And you want to talk about a ghost story? I've just put 100 million people in front of you, dead. And that is a look at actual United States history. And next to that, has Donald Trump done anything yet that would even earn him an impeachment in this background? Something to think about. Happy Halloween. Goodbye.